I will say for this panel, one of the things, this is, my name is Bill Walton, and a lot of the work that I do, I work directly with growers. And so credit to the questions that came up. This was something that Dewey Houck approached me about, was concerns about shelf life. And as we discussed this, we started thinking that this is beyond a grower issue. This is thinking about what happens with the distributor, what happens at the restaurant walk-in, and then what happens out at the shucking table. So the panel was really prompted by a concern by a grower, but I'm really pleased that we've got a pretty broad panel here. I'll go through them. I just mentioned Dewey Houck is a grower with Cypress Point Oyster Company. We've got Eli Kirshtein from Inland Foods, a distributor. Lindsay Allday, you might have just recognized her from a previous panel, but she is I put shucker up there, but there's so many other things, right? Bobby Matos, who is the culinary director at Rocket Farms, and so saw Bobby over at State of Grace last night. And then Julie Chu, who's with the Oyster Master Guild. And so what I wanted to do is I was going to start the discussion with these, but we do want to have time for questions at the end before lunch. So I'm just going to go down the line and let each of you sort of, Dewey, I'll let you start. You should have a microphone. There'll be a slight pause when you click it up before it's live. But could you just introduce yourself, your company, your location, and your favorite thing to do in your job, and your happy place outside of work?
Okay. Dewey Houck, my wife and I, Jody, run Cypress Point Oysters, and we are art processors as well. My favorite thing about my job is going to a fine dining restaurant that's serving our oysters. And then happy place is Disney World.
Eli Kirshtein from Inland Foods. We are a full-service distributor specializing in proteins, been around for about 50 years. My favorite thing is that I get to play with food and talk about food all day. And my happy place is probably at home with my wife and my dachshunds.
Great. Bobby?
Hi, Bobby Matos from Rocket Farm Restaurants. We have restaurants, 4 here in Houston and many more across the southern U.S., mostly based out of Atlanta. My favorite thing at work, is that the question? I mean, the last panel was great because I do the same. Like I used to love when I used to have time to do it, to be out in the oyster bar and shucking and talking to people and really convincing them. And that's part of it, convincing people who, you know, you guys talked about a lot of even Houstonians wouldn't eat oysters. And convincing them to try that first oyster is always fun. And favorite thing to do outside of work is hang out at the lake and not think about work.
Great. Lindsay?
Hey, I'm Lindsay Allday. The name of my company is the Oyster Queen, and I do raw bar catering and pop-ups, but I have a strong hospitality and distribution background as well. My favorite thing about my job is giving someone their first oyster. My happy place outside of work would be in nature with my dogs.
Okay. All right, and Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Chu. I'm the co-founder of Oyster Master Guild. Probably a little bit more well-known for my blog In a Half Shell. And my favorite thing about my work is actually being surprised by things I learn at these events and by growers all the time, and getting to change minds of people who come through our courses and through my social media. And my happy place is probably somewhere warm with my dachshund. So
does this count as warm? Or did we not warm enough?
This is warmer than New York.
So for this, I wanted to start sort of with the end in mind, thinking about when we say shelf life. I know we want to think about what goes into it, but let's actually talk about what does end of shelf life mean. And so I'm going to start with Bobby and Lindsay first here. Sort of, what are the signs that you use to let you know that any given oyster has reached the end of its shelf life? And does that differ when they're served on the half or cooked? So just, Lindsay, I'll let you start.
I use my senses, right?
Okay.
Does it stink? Is it open? Do I want to eat that?
Okay.
And I definitely would cook something a little later in the shelf life than I would serve raw.
So just for those who haven't, what's a signal when you open it up? You said, what do you sense? Is it sight? Is it smell? What are you looking at?
Is it open? Does it smell bad?
Okay.
Is it dry?
So what about the one that you shucked and it was still, you had to shuck it, it wasn't popped. What would you see inside an oyster that make you say, maybe
Less
I'm not?
brine.
Okay.
And musky. There's a musk that kind of comes after.
Bobby, do you have anything?
Yeah, we try to keep our ordering low and bring in multiple orders throughout the week to keep less on the shelves per se. But we move through oysters pretty fast, and so we really never get to the end of the tag life. But as far as, we train our staff that, if, like she said, if anything is at all off, if there's any question at all, it goes in the trash. Like, it's not worth it. So yeah, open oysters, dry oysters, that old dry little snot thing. Yeah.
Okay. Julie, anything you want to add to that, Eli, about how you sort of define end of shelf life?
Yeah, it's interesting. Before this panel, I looked up what the definition of fresh is, and I was talking about it with a few people, and nobody could give me a straight answer. And it's having and obtaining its original traits is the Merriam-Webster definition, which seems like pretty on the nose. So, for me, once it's gotten away from having and obtaining its original traits, that's when it's like, we're done here. Light, it's gotten too light, doesn't sound right, no liquor in it, things like that.
I will say, early in my days at Auburn on Dauphin Island, we did an event at the lab and worked with a restaurant that shall remain unnamed. And the shuckers were not used to dealing with farmed oysters. And we had a number of oysters, and I noticed they'd gotten some wild oysters in, which are fine. But some of those oysters, when you open them up, they had where the mantle tissue was stuck, like they dried out enough that the mantle tissue was stuck. You get that sort of. And it was a little disturbing to me that those all went to the grill. They were still serving those. They were just cooking those. And it just seemed, in terms of a quality, it's safe. It's safe for humans, but it did seem to me like questionable quality.
I think there's if I can butt in, from a restaurant perspective, we're trying to make numbers. And so people are making, sometimes some restaurants will make poor decisions based on the bottom line, which is unfortunate, but it's life.
Yep. Well, speaking of numbers, for any given order of oysters that Lindsay or Bobby, that you would get in, like, how do you track shelf life, and what would prompt a call to somebody like Eli or JT or one of your suppliers? What would lead to a call?
I'm calling if they're open.
You're calling what?
I'm calling if there's clackers, if they're open.
Clackers, and what percentage? Like what's your trigger?
More than a couple of dozen.
What is the percentage?
But when I was in distribution,
So
I got calls.
when you say more than a couple dozen, out of 100?
Out of a sack, yeah.
Okay.
But when I worked in distribution, I definitely had people call me over less than a dozen
Less than a
in
dozen.
a sack,
Yeah.
which is pretty
Bobby?
hard.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we look at more like trends and having like consistent oyster shuckers that know what to look for, and they're pretty good about, because it makes their life harder to sort through all those and keep pulling out more oysters. They'll let you know when they're seeing a lot of dead loss.
Okay. All right. Eli, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we depend on our restaurant partners to communicate, because we're not opening up every single box, every single bag, handling every oyster. We do physically pick them up, and if they feel light or audibly empty, that is a trigger for us, but we don't touch each oyster, so it's difficult to quantify it.
Okay. Well, I'll ask a tough question then. Lindsay, if you were receiving oysters, what do you consider good shelf life? And I know Bobby's mentioned he goes through oysters quickly, so it's hard. But what would you be happy with if you got oysters in? From the day you receive them, what are you looking for?
8 to 10 days, I'm happy with that.
8 to 10 days. Bobby, I know you if you ever did keep oysters for
No,
longer.
I mean, we usually try to get all of everything in within 5 to 6, 7 days.
5 to 6 to 7 days of harvest.
Yeah,
But then how long are you looking for it to be sellable product?
within
for you?
a couple days.
Couple days.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't always happen. We just had the whole city shut down last Sunday for a freeze, and that's a big oyster selling day for our restaurants. So, we have to go in and actively inspect how they have things ordered, what's going in onto the ice next, make sure that nothing's getting too old.
Julie, I'll ask you that. If you got a shipment of oysters, is there something that you would be, again, I don't know how long you might keep oysters, but if you kept them, what would you expect for?
It depends on the oyster, for sure. I think I would expect a bit less from a West Coast oyster, probably 10 days out of the water is max. I've had Virginicas in my fridge for over a month, and they've been fine. I kind of forgot about them, to be honest, but I tried them, and some of the northern oysters that are used to being shut for a long time, they are phenomenal at staying alive for that long. Going back to the fresh note, by the way, I think we forget sometimes that those are live animals, so it's really life support and how alive you can allow your oysters to be under refrigeration.
Dewey, I'm going to go to you now. If that's starting with what we're defining, the end of shelf life, want to think about what happens on the farm that might affect shelf life. And so, as a grower, like what are 2, 3 key factors that you think drive shelf life or at least need to be better understood? These are thinking about ones that growers might control.
Sure. So Bill talks about shelf life, and I tend to think of it as the Mr. Hyde of shelf life, and that's cooler death. And what we see in the summer is that if we cool the oysters too rapidly, they're going to die. I mean, it's just, and it has to do with the ultimate water temperature. So if they're in anywhere above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, we start to worry. And we try to lengthen the cooling process because they cool in an asymmetric decline. It's not a linear cooling ramp. They're Newtonian bodies, and they cool very fast. And so the shell cools 5 times faster than the tissue does. And so that thermal shear is possibly what kills them. But we've found that they definitely die if they cool too fast. So that's one. If they're handled roughly, either tumbled or cold shortly before they go in the cooler, they're going to die. And then the last thing is that we've had very bad luck on long-haul trucking. With typically our oysters will go in the back of a truck that's at 30 degrees, and that's just too cold. And generally, if they're going from our place to Orlando, it's not a problem. But if they're going to Kansas City or Denver, we tend to have problems. So cooling them too fast, the back of a too cold truck, and then handling them roughly before they go to market.
And I'm sure a lot of growers are going to be concerned about, you have to meet those time temperature requirements. So you're suggesting like still meeting those time temperature requirements.
Has to be. I mean, fundamentally, refrigeration and regulation, we live and die by making sure that these oysters are safe. So we execute the rapid cooling exactly the way it's supposed to. It's just that when the oysters are too warm, sometimes that kills them.
And so you'd suggest maybe like a slower ramp down that still meets the requirement.
Indeed.
Right. Just out of curiosity, you mentioned that handling them too rough, you think leads to shelf life loss. What do you think is doing that? What's driving that?
Broken lips.
Okay. And so the broken lips are leading to them draining their liquor?
Yep.
Right. And I think I think it's interesting when you think about it is a live animal. And so those gills, the animal is built to stay out of water. And it will get oxygen out of the air across its gills. But those gills need to be wet to work. And so I'll even in my fridge, I will not put them in water, but I'll put a damp dish towel over the top of the container just to keep the humidity up in the container that they're in. And we'll get into some of that. But, and then you mentioned the trucking. So, from a distributor's point of view, Eli, I know there's a lot of things that go into this. Well, what about seasonality? Have you seen any patterns with seasonality, and does it differ by harvest area?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the regulations are different from area to area to area. Warm water is a concern. The Gulf is a concern during the summertime. Additionally, that thermal shock is an issue. We have pretty strict regulations about how we have to handle all of our products. And if it's going from a relatively warm climate into our environment, which is, 34 degrees all the time, we do experience dead loss. We're very candid with farmers when we're concerned about what that looks like. We're very candid about saying, like, this might not be the best time to be moving things through the system.
For a time of year, if it were Texas, because when would you be telling Texans to be thinking about that here?
I mean, I can't remember the exact day on the regulation, but the step down, overnight, one day it goes from you have 4 hours to you have 90 minutes.
Right. Okay.
And that's problematic. Okay. We're fortunate that we do have a warehouse here in Houston, so a lot of farmers are able to get it into our warehouse relatively rapidly. But it's a concern in the warm months because, as everybody in Texas knows, there's days it's 110 degrees outside.
would you recommend, is there anything a grower could do better in terms of how they provide you the oysters, or that they're doing that's a mistake? Like, for example, shoveling scoops of ice onto the oyster.
Yeah, so on our prep call, we had a long conversation about, ice things. It's like, everybody knows they're living in salt water, they're not living in fresh water. And when they're in these sealed, when you're putting them in these tubs because you don't want it to leak in the back of your truck and you're shoveling ice on it, and then it's sitting in fresh water, that's not great. In our live shellfish room, the temperature is actually a hair warmer than the rest of our building. And we don't really have ice in that room. We want everything to kind of breathe and not thermal shock the animals.
Can I add that packaging, I've noticed, also plays a huge deal. When you go into a wholesaler, there's like boxes of oysters, there's bags, and then sacks. And I find like when you have oysters that are very loose in a bag, it kind of is like inadvertently tumbling on a truck and in the thing. But there's tightly packed French or Irish oyster boxes that are covered on top with seaweed, so it keeps the hydration in the package. And their products seem to last much longer.
Bobby, I'll jump ahead because I know we talked about some packaging. Like, what's something you've noticed with, you had a particular request for packaging with your oysters?
Well, in the restaurant business, the space is not a lot. There's not a lot of space in most walk-in coolers, so we really enjoy the boxes. I don't know what size they are. But then it's also important, there's holes in those boxes to drain the water out, and those holes sometimes can be way higher than they need to be, so they're still sitting in like a half inch of water and not being able to drain. But we prefer the boxes. Do I personally know if it helps the oyster or not? I don't know. It's not my specialty. But the boxes make things nice and tight. We can label each box with a wax pen, and when they came in, what it is. It makes life easy. The bags are great. They're less space consuming, but they don't stack well.
Right.
Yeah, let me add to that real quick. As a distributor, we strongly prefer boxes as well. They stack better on trucks, the handling's gonna be better, and then we don't have to put it into an additional box and create an additional carbon footprint in the shipping process.
And then, so following up, thinking about what's happened after the harvest. So you're in the walk-in. For anybody who's dealt with walk-in, what are some of the handling in the walk-in, like things that you would recommend or caution about? Lindsay, I'll start with you. Like,
Somebody just touched on this, but don't put ice on them in the walk-in, please.
don't what?
Don't put ice on them in the walk-in,
Yeah.
please.
All right. Anything else you like to see in the walk-in?
Labels.
Labels?
Yeah, to me, it's just about order. In a world of chaos, it's nice to have a little bit of order, especially when you have thousands and thousands of oysters in your walk-in. It makes life easier.
What about in terms
and
of
yeah, if
shelf?
there's not ice in the box, excuse me, sorry. I see sometimes they pack the ice in the box, and it just creates more water, more mess, and then there's water on the ground. And because if we put them on a sheet pan, then that sheet pan collects the water, and then it defeats the whole purpose of the box's draining. So.
But is there something in the walk-in that you think increases shelf life or shortens it? I think one of the things I had talked about is I was sort of surprised, like I think, Bobby, you like to keep your walk-in very dry. And like one of the things that would worry me is trying to keep oysters is like if I have a walk-in where it's dehumidifying, that if you put them right below the fan, right. And if you're in a dry walk-in, is there a way, like, do you keep the lid on? Like, those are, what tips would you have that if you were a grower and you walked into one of your favorite restaurants walk-ins, is there some things that you'd say, hey, could you do this or do that? Are there any things like that? You mentioned not keeping in water, maybe not having ice on them, keeping away from the fan.
Yeah, I agree with the fan drying them out. That's why I like the boxes, I think. Like again, space is so limited. It's hard what you can do.
Being careful about having your door open when you're loading in your walk-in and things like that too, because the temperature drops or changes pretty quickly.
And for those who've watched the news, definitely not putting, this is not related to shelf life, but not putting them below the chicken that might drip would be a mistake. I'm going to jump back to something that might happen. This isn't on the farm, but what about wet storage as a tool? Like, is that something Does that help with shelf life? Just, any one of you could jump in. I know, Julie, I see you. I know that was one of your most popular blogs, right? But Eli.
Yeah, one of the challenges we have is we get a lot of commentary from customers who have an arbitrary date. They're only worried about how many days out of the water. They don't care about any of the hedonics of it, the quality of the oyster. It's just how many days. So there's an advantage to that. I mean, just from a culinary standpoint, if you're putting all these different varieties of oysters into an aquarium, they're going to taste like the aquarium. So we don't really participate in that. We don't love it. We don't like the idea of it. And it's not about like cheating or anything like that. Like I respect why people do it, especially in difficult months where harvesting can be really difficult. But it just sort of goes counterintuitive to the idea of having unique oysters.
You want to add to that? Go ahead, Julie.
I think it's worth differentiating the different kinds of wet storage and when it happens, because I don't have any problem with producers who will put their oysters in their own wet storage system, let them chill out for a few days before packing them and shipping them. I think that, in my experience, having spoken to a lot of growers with that practice, it does help extend their life. What Eli just said was, at maybe the wholesaler distributor end and dumping all the oysters that have had a long journey into the same tank, that's kind of disturbing for me. But I understand why they do it, and if it does help hydrate the oyster, allowing them to breathe, to off gas, whatever, for a market that's very far away, I understand why they do it. I think from just having more freshness, sure, but is that trade-off worth taking for flavor? That's the question.
And I would add that when we say wet storage in the National Shellfish Sanitation Plan, like there's a lot of different wet storage. So there's not only who does it, but how is it being done? Is it flow-through wet storage? Is it, in some cases, some states call wet storage where you're keeping it on a raft out in the open water. That's called wet storage. There's systems on land where you're pumping water right from where you're harvesting the oysters and it's going through the system. And then there's closed wet storage, where now you've got a recirculating system, and that water could be local water originally, but it's probably going to change over time and potentially affect that. But from a grower's perspective, it's a great way to take a large quantity of oysters, have them ready to go, and you can harvest very quickly and meet all time temperature requirements versus maybe going out on your farm. So farmers could consider that as an option. But anybody else have any thoughts about wet storage? All right. Well, let's go to, let's talk about, Julie, you touched on this. What happens during shelf life and thinking about the difference between fresh and quality? Can you talk a little bit, you've talked about dry aging of oysters. So I wanted you to expand on that here because I think it's relevant.
Okay, so I think I was trying to play with the idea of what defines freshness within the culinary realm, because I've heard from oyster farmers complaining that some chefs will demand their products to be 1 or 2 days out of the water, and that's just insanely unrealistic. The end buyer believes that they have to have an oyster that is within X days out of the water to be good to serve, and maybe there are some rules about that in different states. So I guess from a dry aging standpoint, knowing that dry aging is such a trendy practice now that's being done on, it's been done on meats, but now seafood, you see a lot of dry aging techniques on seafoods. And it was just a play on words between wet storage and dry aging, because literally when you lift your oysters out of the water, it's essentially dry aging to some degree, given that it's still a live animal. For me, I have found that growers have shipped their oysters to me. Many of you are in this room, actually. And I've put them in my refrigerator for several days, and I actually prefer the taste of them after 3 to 5 days, and even further. That flavor does concentrate, the texture changes, and I think it just becomes a deeper, richer, more complex oyster that has allowed itself to sort of filter that fresh seawater and start to go from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism and kind of convert all its, anyway, long chemical story that I won't get into, but it improves the flavor. And when you talk about flavor benefits to a chef, they pay attention. And I think that's when they start to rethink this hard rule of wanting oysters that are just a few days out of the water.
Eli, anything you want to add to that? Thinking a little bit about sort of the changes during shelf life, the difference between fresh and quality.
Yeah, I mean, the dry aged steak is kind of an interesting thing to point out because I don't think anybody's ever said a dry aged steak is fresh. I don't think that's verbiage that's ever been used. We don't mess with it. You know, I've never had somebody ever say, oh, you know, you could have more days on this tag and that would be cool with me.
Right.
You know, we are in the business of bringing oysters in and getting them out to customers as quickly as possible. And I also don't know what the world looks like around the food safety regulations around that, and that's, you know, I get my wrist slapped anytime I suggest.
Well, to the best of my understanding, there's no, if you're keeping oysters at temp, you're not adding any human health risk. There's only changes in quality because the Vibrio should not be proliferating. So I don't think it could affect, I will say, there'd be some flavors. I've also kept oysters way too long on purpose, and there have been ones that I've tried and ones that I've also been like, maybe not. And I don't know, I don't know if that's just bad seafood at that point. Like, was it really live or was I eating seafood gone bad? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, from a culinary standpoint, like, I think it's an interesting exercise. Right. From a commerce standpoint, I think it's tricky.
Well, what I think is that what I love about the dry aging is getting people to think about that it doesn't necessarily, that the oyster is not necessarily at its peak when you take it out of the water. And I know this is probably not a popular, like, we all think when you take the apple off the tree, it's at its peak when you take it off. But I know this is forgive me, Kevin Cox, for I have sinned. When I'm on a farm and somebody gives me an oyster, I put my finger on that oyster and I pour out the salt water and I wait a minute and I eat the oyster. Because my experience has been if I wanted a mouthful of seawater, I would have put my mouth down to the water and it had a mouthful of seawater. I find it overwhelming with just water. And I learned that in Massachusetts because I was growing clams and oysters there, and they were so salty that I was getting this burst of salt from the water, and then it was gone. I felt like it was oyster pop rocks, like poof. And so for me, being able to dump that water off was a way to get more flavor out of the oyster. And I think that's exactly what's happening with dry aging. The oysters keep checking in your walk-in, they keep checking to see if the tide has come back in. So they open up a little bit and they get some oxygen across their gills and they lose a little bit of that water. And you're giving them a chance to, I think, taste the flavor of the oyster rather than the water that they came out of. So I'm a fan of that, and I actually agree. I prefer them probably 3 days out of the water or so. I think they have more flavor. So are there any other thoughts from you all about things that you'd like to ask or mention about shelf life, things that are on Dewey? I know like this was one of your concerns about what we could do as an industry to improve shelf life and address shelf life.
Yeah, I think that while we did some informal experiments, we would harvest oysters and set aside 50 in the corner of the cooler and then check on them the next week and check on them the next week. And so in the height of the summer, we were seeing 100% death after 2 weeks. And so we don't know. First of all, one is what should we do about it? Should we just not harvest, or should we more aggressively address the rapid or adaptive rapid cooling while staying within the regulations? But we did prove to ourselves that we were seeing 100% death after 2 weeks in very warm water. So I'd like to know what very warm water means. Right. You know, is that 86? Is it 87? Is it 88 for our water? And so that is the greatest need for us, is to, you know, put our finger on what that number is so we can make a decision about what we'd like to do about it.
I know there was one topic that we had discussed like in the pregame for this, and it was we've all shucked oysters and put them on ice, or not shucked oysters. The oysters that we're serving at an event, which whether it's a restaurant or a catering or personal, you might put those on ice, and then you start shucking from the pile of oysters that are on the ice, and maybe it slows down at the end of the night, and so you've put 25 oysters, a couple dozen oysters on the ice that you're now like taking back. Like my experience has been that those oysters don't survive as well. Any thoughts about how to avoid that sort of, because I think it's maybe the temperature shock, but they don't seem to do that well. Is there any way, anything that you do to sort of handle that, Lindsay?
just pay attention to the flow of business that's coming at you and be like, okay, I need to stop icing now, and then run these out, because you are getting less days on them after they've been iced, for sure.
Because I know that's difficult for folks who are running to catering events. You're probably bringing all the oysters probably in a cooler with ice. So they're probably all getting ice. I would say probably don't put them directly in contact with ice. I do put a burlap. I try to keep them off the ice themselves.
Keep
so
them
they're
off
not
the
getting
ice,
it.
use
Yeah.
gel packs.
Any other thoughts about ice on oysters in terms of like the recovery? I know you, Bobby, you're also, I know at your restaurant, you try not to put out too many oysters.
That's the whole goal. Just put out what you need, and then you can always keep refilling. There's no need to put out all of them.
All right. Any other thoughts about it? I'd like to, any questions for these folks on shelf life or comments? Megan, do you have a microphone? Here you go. You got one?
Let's make sure it works.
You had talked about ice in your box. Water in your box. Where's that coming from? Is that from the producer or the distributor?
Yeah, generally from the oyster itself and or ice that's packed on top of them in the boxes.
So we pack in boxes, but we don't put ice on top of them. So I'm just wondering, is that the farmers doing that, or is that the distributor? Or
I'm guessing it's this distributor.
yeah, we'll have to look out for that.
Well, I hope I can be brief, but this is a case history for when the Florida clam industry on the West Coast took off in the 1990s. A lot of clams going out, and in the summer we had a reputation of poor shelf life, both real and perceived. So we knew we had to do something about it. I got a seafood technology specialist come in. We evaluated several post-harvest methods. Again, this is cultured clams, not oysters. And the one that seemed to make the most sense, realistically, at a processing plant was to do a step-down acclimation. We since then called it dry tempering. We evaluated several hours at around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, coming from 88 plus degrees water temperature prior to going into customary refrigerated storage at 45. And it warranted both commercial and regulatory considerations. We took this to the ISSC. They said, nope, go back to your state regulatory authority. We went through 2 rulemaking sessions with 2 different agencies in Florida to get it approved. That was 4 years later. And then once we did, and our processors accepted that and moved all their grading equipment into a refrigerated room, FDA came back and said, well, we need to look at this from a Vibrio vinificus perspective. We did all that work. It's there in place, and after all that, then several other southern states said, well, we might have a shelf life problem too. So that's been expanded. Again, clams, and I know we're on a much more stringent time temperature matrix with oysters, but that dry tempering method worked for clams, does work for clams.
Dewey, it's loud. Dewey, this is a question for you. I'm over here to the right. So we're talking about in the summer getting oysters coming out of hotter water. You don't want to go straight to say 45 or 40 degrees because you may kill the oyster. Is there sort of a standard differential you could say works where basically at this water temperature and under, it's fine to go straight to final cooling temperature. And then from that point up, your intermediary cooling should be 20 degrees below water temperature at any given time. So if it's 70 degrees in the water you're pulling out of, you go to 50 in the cooler. If it's 80 degrees, you go to 60, something like that.
I'd love to know what those numbers are. It's somewhere in the mid to high 80s Fahrenheit, but we don't know what the top end number is. And also, just to go back on we visited a farmer in Texas 2.5-3 years ago, and they were having trouble with cooler death. And what they have done is move to an intermediate strategy similar to the tempering strategy that Leslie's talked about, which is to take an intermediate cooler at 50 degrees or 55 degrees or 60 degrees, let them cool there for a while, and then move them into your 40 or 45 degree cooler. So there's a lot of study that needs to be done, and I think that we can get it done safely, but we need to really study the problem more than we have so far.
And Dewey, I would say also you might want to mention, do you typically go into a 45-degree cooler, or aren't you, to get to temperature, you need to get to 45, right?
No, you have to get to less than 50.
50, okay.
Yeah,
So,
and so the 45 number is they can't go into refrigerated trucking at less than 45.
Hi, Jim Mine with PMAR. I want to touch on something that Rutvik mentioned at the last panel, which is this concept of seasonality. And in Texas, in the farmers I know, they're all trying to produce a product that they sell every single month of the year. And in kind of traditional farming, you know, apples are in season in Washington at a certain time, or cherries. And what I presume is that they're worried about, you know, if they aren't on your menu, then someone else will fill that slot for them. But from the distribution and maybe more from the restaurant side, you know, what do you think of the concept of, you know, just selling oysters when they're actually at season?
Yeah, from a distribution standpoint, for us, it's about when we're selling them, having enough critical mass of that week or whatever it may be. If somebody says to me, I've got 100, I got 200, it's very difficult for that to work for anybody in our ecosystem. If it's a seasonal rotation, that's totally fine. Hey, it's blacked out for this period of time, that works. When it's spotty weeks, we've got it this week, we don't have it the next two, I got it 1 week, the next two is off, that's hard because people do print menus, people do staff education, and it's really difficult for them to have that rotation. But if it's seasonal and there's just blackout periods, like that's fine. We have, you know, species of fish that just aren't available sometimes a year. You know, I mean, speckled trout out of the Gulf, that's a cold weather fish. When it goes away, it's just not available. So that's manageable when there's at least a little bit of margin of reliability.
And from the restaurant side, we use a purveyor, a distributor that I essentially tell him how many oysters I want at each restaurant weekly, and he has a handbag of 20 to 30 different growers, and he spreads the love out, so it takes the heat off of me, so I don't have to get, you know, people coming knocking down my door. But every time a grower comes to me or I meet somebody new, I send them to him, and he puts them in their rotation. That's kind of, so I let him do the work.
And so I've been doing a 1-year taste analysis study with some producers from around the country where I'm tasting their oysters every season, every other 4 months, just to understand what the flavor difference is. I guess you could do two approaches. One is like if you really want to experience the beautiful variations in an oyster that is a natural product, I think you can tell that story and showcase the oyster at different conditions. Maybe that's not for everybody. It's for your Uber fans who put a lot of trust in what you're doing, or just sourcing different varieties. But I found that having the same oyster over the course of a year, when it is, of course, available, is really interesting to understand the experience does change, and then you kind of understand like what's happening in the environment as well.
We probably have time for one, maybe two more.
Hi, my question's about the marketability and moving more volume. We see Gulf at, 32 cents delivered to distributors now. Restaurants are 38, 40 cents. We see aquaculture at 75 to $1, $1.15 to the restaurants. If you had a lower price point, or at how much, would you move more product? And is people really conscious of looking at that price on the menu when oysters are at $2.50, for example, in some restaurants? Does that really affect your sales? Do you hear people talk about that?
I'm guessing this one's pointed at me. We sell, I would venture to guess 70% of our oysters at happy hour. It's just, that's what people want to pay, going back to the brand recognition of people learning about oysters, tasting them, and then coming back. Maybe they're not on happy hour. We still see people buy those oysters because they know they have that brand recognition. Every time I meet a new oyster grower, I always recommend they find a way to grow out cheaper, bigger oysters and sell them at that market price for dredged oysters. So because there's going to be a point we sell a lot of cooked oysters. So that's always my recommendation. You know, diversify yourself. I don't know if that works for y'all.
This is for inland. What do you do when you're faced with a situation like what's going on in PEI right now?
You know, we typically try to make sure that we have the best education that we possibly can give to our staff so that our staff can communicate it to the customer. We realize we're all in the same boat. It's not just like inland doesn't have it this week, so there has to be some random excuse or whatever it may be. It is what it is. You know, it's the realities of the situation. You know, I mean, there's a lot of weird things going on in land proteins right now. I don't know if anybody knows, but you basically can't get veal. It's just not possible. We just have to communicate the best facts possible because that goes downstream to the restaurateurs who are communicating to their staff, who are communicating it to their diners and their guests. It's just about communication. I mean, there's nothing we can do, you know.
I think we have one, time.
From the standpoint of holding oysters after you've either put them in your cooler or purchased them and holding them in your fridge at home, I've heard it said that the best way to store them is with the cup side down. So you actually got to go into all your oysters and, you know, rotate them in the proper direction. Does that actually make sense, or is that a myth? Because from a labor perspective, when you're shipping them, I would think that that would be a big deal.
Yeah, Brian says impossible. Anybody else want to add to that?
There are Canadian growers who will take the time to put every single oyster cup-side down. Taylor Shellfish does it as well with their shigokus. It does make a difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of producers. I mean, I think kind of the platonic ideal of packaging is like Beausoleil oysters out of the Northeast. They're all like that, but you pay a premium for that. You do absolutely pay a premium for that work.
You know, if it's right that it's the gills drying out, that makes sense because you're giving a greater chance for that oyster to keep the gills wet by being in that position. So I just want to, where are my shuckers at? Got a few shuckers here? All right. Julie and I are going to talk at 1:30 about shuckability of an oyster. So I know lunch is on your own, but we would really love to have everyone back, but we definitely want to have some shuckers to help us talk about shuckability. But I want to thank this panel for a great time up here and appreciate their answers for this. Thank you, everyone.